Why does China have so many conflicts around the globe? When we think of China's potential enemies, we may think of America, or maybe Taiwan. But, do you know China currently has conflicts with India, Bhutan, Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, Lithuania, South Korea, Paraguay, Brunei, Canada, Marshall Islands, Nepal, Honduras, Tajikistan, Czech Republic, Singapore, Laos, and even with Russia, with their claim on the Russian port city of Vladivostok. The Chinese conflicts we listed don't include ideological battles, or violation of agreements, or diplomatic snubs. Even in countries like Pakistan, which China dominates completely, regular protests, and sporadic attacks on Chinese citizens, do occur. Many of Pakistan's citizens have been deprived of their livelihood, due to China's interference with their BRI project. Of course, Pakistan gets a severe scolding from China when Chinese citizens are harmed. Similarly, there are several protests and disapproval of Chinese presence in very many countries, like Vietnam, Maldives, Nepal, Solomon Islands, Congo, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. This begs a simple question. Why does China have so many conflicts around the globe? It's important to note historically, China was not involved in global conflicts, as much as the other global powers. Under the imperial rule for over 2,000 years, China was a very self-sufficient country. During the 19th and 20th centuries, China was attacked repeatedly by the Western powers and Japan. When the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under Mao Zedong came to power in 1949, they brought in a culture of conflict, warmongering, expansionism, and occupation of territories. Even though China had become poor, due to the Western empires, who subjugated the Chinese to their will, Mao was willing to enter into wars, without giving a second thought. In less than a year after the Communists took over, the Chinese army was directly involved in the Korean War, against the mighty United States Army. Mao was willing to let the Chinese soldiers die, in large numbers, in what was not a territorial, but an ideological battle. Even prior to that, Mao had started his expansionist policy. Mao wanted to take over lands, he stated, as belonging to China, like Tibet, though Tibet had been a sovereign nation, independent of China, for a large part of its 5,000-year history. Mao's first annexation, in early 1950, was the land that was known as East Turkestan, and is now called as Xinjiang. Tibet was occupied since 1951, and annexed in 1959, driving out the Dalai Lama to India. Since India accepted a large section of the Tibetan refugees, including the Dalai Lama, China found an excuse to start a conflict with India. Throughout the 1950s, India, under its Prime Minister Nehru, had tried its level best to be friendly to China. As early as 1949, after the CCP took over China, India refused to accept US aid, if it meant to take a stand against China, in international forums. Despite Nehru's personal attention to strengthen the relationship with China, at a huge cost to India, Nehru couldn't prevent the subsequent India-China War, in 1962. The feeling of betrayal and distrust with China prevails in India, till date. In 1953, after Stalin's passing away, when Khrushchev became the Soviet leader, Mao Zedong turned against the Soviet Union, despite the Soviets pouring a lot of money to industrialize China and transfer military technology, including nuclear weapons. Mao's interest in picking up quarrels with the Soviets resulted in several armed border conflicts, including the biggest one, in the late 1960s. The public position of China was, they opposed Soviets on ideological grounds. Under Khrushchev, the Soviets wished to have a peaceful coexistence with the United States and the West, and brought a moderation policy, named as de-Stalinization, removing some of the brutal suppression internally, and aggression in its foreign policy. However, the Chinese were opposed to a peaceful coexistence with those who didn't follow communism, and Mao believed that the Soviets were no more true believers of Marxism. Though territorial expansionism and border claims led to the armed conflict between the Soviet Union and China, Mao insisted his dislike with the Soviets was with their revisionist policy of diluting Marxism. Mao had developed a sense of paranoia about several nations, that he constantly and consistently remained suspicious with them throughout his life. The Chinese Communist Party had imbibed a culture of hostility, and this affected China's relations with many nations in the world. Mao's death put a temporary period of reprieve, when Deng Xiaoping proclaimed, China wanted to follow a path of peaceful rise. This was probably the only period in the Chinese Communist Party's history since their inception, when they didn't want to follow a policy of conflict, aggression, and expansionism. However, even during Deng Xiaoping's rule, China went to a war with Vietnam, in 1979. Despite Deng's interest in teaching Vietnam a lesson, China was badly beaten in that war. This was the beginning of the short period, during which the Communist China paused its aggressive, expansionist policy. Deng Xiaoping abandoned the strict socialistic model of economy, and brought in market reforms, coming closer to Japan, and the Western nations, mainly the United States. However, due to the rapid industrialization, and subsequent increase in money flow, the Communist China went back to its policies of territorial expansionism, and conflicts again. The process of disputing lands that have been settled through internationally recognized treaties was the new aggressive position by China, since Jiang Zemin's period, who was the successor of Deng Xiaoping. This gradual process of territorial expansionism was enhanced during Hu Jintao's period, when he took over the leadership in 2002, from Jiang Zemin. Hu Jintao's policy of expansionism was related mainly to maritime boundaries. During Hu Jintao's period, China was aggressively expanding its claim, based on an arbitrary line in the South China Sea, called the Nine-Dash Line, defined unilaterally by China. Historically, the islands within the Nine-Dash Line have been under the control of nations that are closer to the islands. On the Chinese claims on the South China Sea, Hillary Clinton, the former U.S. Secretary of State, once ridiculed, when she said, China's claim of South China Sea is so absurd, and it'll be similar if India claimed the entire Indian Ocean, because its name appears on it. Of course, India has never claimed the Indian Ocean, beyond what is rightfully its own, as per the internationally agreed maritime borders, unlike China. Hu Jintao went on with the ambitious plan of creating artificial islands in South China Sea, with the intention of setting up military bases. When the US objected to these islands, Hu and China lied to them, that those islands will not be militarized. It should come as no surprise China reneged on their promise, and now the artificial islands are armed to their teeth. Hu's successor Xi Jinping took the level of aggression and intention of grabbing territory belonging to its neighbors to the next level. When Xi Jinping tightened his grip on China, it appeared Mao Zedong and his brutal totalitarian attitude seemed to have come back in full force. Xi Jinping pushed China's aggressive policies to the next gear, and ignored any international rule or law. For Xi Jinping, any agreement China had signed with its neighbors in the past meant nothing at all. He has shown absolute disregard to the laws, that he constantly and consistently violated all international norms. Let's look at some of the specifics to understand how China had gone completely rogue. The international community has long accepted the rules-based maritime order, where international law, as reflected in the UN Law of the Sea Convention, sets out the legal framework for all activities in the oceans and seas. In 2016, the Arbitral Tribunal constituted under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, delivered a unanimous and enduring decision, firmly rejecting China's expansive South China Sea maritime claims, as having no basis in international law. However, China rejected the laws that protected all civilized nations, and rejected the ruling by the court. The ruling by the tribunal was given to the petition filed by Philippines, to stop the illegal Chinese grab of Scarborough Shoal Islands, belonging to Philippines. Similarly, the Senkaku Islands belonging to Japan has had territorial violations by China, illegally, on a regular basis. Japan also has a dispute over Ryukyu Islands with China. The Paracel Islands, Spratly Islands, Pratas Island, Verica Banks, the Macclesfield Bank are all claimed by China, without any legal or historical basis, as they have been administered by Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and others, which are much closer to those islands or reefs, than China. China has been involved in illegal fishing, in waters around the Indonesian islands of Natuna. Subsequently, they laid claims on the islands, with no legal basis. South Korea has been in a conflict with Chinese violations, over the Socotra Rock in the East China Sea, which is within the exclusive economic zone of South Korea. Almost in all cases, the Chinese naval ships have encouraged their own fishing boats, to ram the fishermen's boats of Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, and Singapore. This has resulted in huge economic loss for these countries, and many a times, had involved in loss of lives as well. Even with North Korea, which is another satellite country of China, China has figured out to have disputes, both in land, and in the Sea of Japan. If sea disputes were not enough, China has land disputes with almost all their neighbors. India and China have clashed a few times in the past decade, but the one that involved loss of life to 20 Indian soldiers, was in June of 2020, when the Chinese violated past agreements, and unilaterally sprang into an armed conflict, and illegally tried to grab land, within Indian territory. The Indians were caught by total surprise, as they had not expected China to arbitrarily ignore the long-standing agreements on conflict, but were able to inflict pain on China, in a higher measure. International spy satellites assessed Chinese deaths of over 40, and an equal number of injured Chinese soldiers. China utilized an opportune time, when a corrupt communist leader in Nepal was the prime minister, to grab the Rui village inside Nepal. Despite what appeared to be extremely close relations with China, Nepal couldn't recover the land lost to China. The corrupt prime minister was subsequently removed from office. Even the most peaceful country on earth, Bhutan, had to deal with constant attempt of a land grab by China, or disputes with China in eastern Bhutan, including areas like Do, Gasoa, Chakip Gampa, and Dungma. Bhutan has a formal treaty with India to provide protection against its enemy, China. Laos, another friendly country of China, had to deal with Chinese claims and disputes of a large chunk of its border area. Myanmar accused China many times of border conflicts, and instigating terror groups. Tibet, Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia, which have been annexed by force by China, have never accepted China's rule. It's getting increasingly obvious, to even nations that have been under the Chinese influence for too long, like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Laos, Myanmar, Nepal, Kenya, Djibouti, Nigeria, and many others, that China is a bully, which doesn't honor any agreement, and dealing with China is a dangerous game that's bound to hurt them. However, due to the extremely high level of internal corruption, and large amounts of debt owed to China, these countries are unable to come out of the firm grip by China, on their throats. Thanks for watching.